Okay, here we go. So, desperate times call for desperate measures. I'll try to stay in frame. I'm going to keep this in mind. So this is the first video of a series of videos I'm filming because of the COVID-19 crisis. These are a series of videos for my philosophy and arts class. This one is on Immanuel Kant. The material's taken from his critique of judgment, focusing primarily on his philosophy of art from that book. So for those of you who are students of mine, who will probably be the first people to watch this video, I'll be posting it on the web for posterity and for everybody. I'm starting from the top, so some of this stuff we've already covered. I'm going to try to keep these videos to about 30-45 minutes, maybe an hour at the most. And so this first video, we'll see how far that gets us. I'm thinking Kant will probably be 3 or 4 videos. Schopenhauer is next. Hopefully I'll get a little bit better at this as they progress. So right now I'm just filming this in my gallery on my iPhone. And this is very artificial for me, so I gotta get really used to this. I'm used to having students to interact with, but obviously that's not possible right now. So anyway, without further ado, let's get to the lecture. The first part on Immanuel Kant's philosophy of art, his aesthetics from his critique of judgment, otherwise known as the third critique. So we covered David Hume before Kant in this class, and we covered his short essay, Standard of Taste. When we covered that, I talked a little bit about his empiricism. We talked a little bit about that philosophy. It's more of an epistemology, a theory of knowledge. This class we're focusing on philosophies of art or aesthetics, but I think it is absolutely necessary, if you're going to really appreciate Kant fully, to kind of wrap your mind, at least to some extent, wrap your mind around his epistemology, or at least, if you don't want to call it epistemology, his response to this whole debate in epistemology. It was kind of the, I guess you might say, the focus of modern philosophy, the focus of philosophy during this time period, one of the focuses in epistemology, this debate between rationalism on the one hand, which I have here, a portrait of Descartes, he's our representative for that, and empiricism on the other. David Hume is the representative there. So again, it's a philosophy of art class, but just as a little introduction, let's talk a little bit about these different theories of knowledge, not art, and then we'll get to Kant's theory and how it sort of applies to these guys, right? How is it that he fits into this debate between the rationalist and the empiricist? And then finally, hopefully, at least most of this video, we'll finally get to how this applies to art and our experience, I guess primarily of art, what you would call the aesthetic experience. So again, Descartes here on the left, he's a rationalist, David Hume is the empiricist, and Kant is somewhere in the middle, right? So we'll get to him last, we'll save the best for last, or, it's up to you to decide that. But Descartes we haven't talked about this semester, Hume we have, right? So this will be a little bit of review for some of my students who have already gone over the Hume lecture. But Descartes, so he's famous for the quote, "I think, therefore I am." You probably heard his name several times if you've taken courses in mathematics. His influence can't be understated, right? A very important philosopher, right? But in this context, we're talking about the debate between rationalism and empiricism, okay? So for Descartes, he's, what you're going to call a rationalist. He's going to believe that knowledge, right? Rationalism is a theory of knowledge. It's an epistemology. Knowledge is based on reason and understanding, right? The basis of knowledge is my ability to understand concepts, to apply those concepts to particular situations, particular experiences, and that's sort of a very general definition of rationalism, right? Knowledge based on reason. Now, again, we talked about David Hume already in a previous lecture in this class. He's the empiricist, right? All knowledge is based on experience, okay? So what are the arguments for these two viewpoints, right? Knowledge based on reason and understanding, my mind, my ability to conceptualize things and to apply my understanding of those concepts to particular truths or particular bits of knowledge, and this theory that my knowledge is based on not my understanding particularly, but my experience, right? Something that I've experienced in the past. My knowledge is built upon all of those things, right? So what are the arguments for these two positions very quickly? Descartes thinks that when I claim to know something, particularly even when I claim to know physical objects, right? The basis for my knowledge is always going to be my intellect, what he calls my understanding. There's parts of my intellect, like my imagination, which he doesn't seem to think are the essential part in my knowing. So one of his famous arguments comes from the Meditations. He uses this example of a piece of wax, right? It's a honeycomb, and he describes what he sees, right, and what he smells, and what he can feel when he touches the wax, the noise that the wax makes. All the things that his senses are reporting to him, right? And so you would think, okay, well, all right, well, obviously I know the wax through my senses. But wait a minute, Descartes says, if I take this piece of wax and I put it close to a fire, all those things that my senses reported to me, its hardness, its smell, its shape, everything about the wax has completely changed, and yet I know it is still the same wax, right? How do I know that? Where does my knowledge of that wax come from? It can't be from my senses, he argues, because if I go with just my senses alone, then I wouldn't be able to sort of say it's the same thing. I'd have to, at every moment of time, at every second that it's changing, I'd have to pronounce it as something different, as something new. But because my mind understands that wax can change and that it can change shapes and forms under different conditions, that's my intellect that understands that. That is what allows me to know it's the same wax, not my senses alone, right? So that's the basic argument we get from Descartes. Now, what's Hume's argument? He's going to say, no, the reason that you know anything about anything, wax or otherwise, is because you've had previous experiences of objects, wax-like objects, right? And you know when wax-like objects get near hot objects, wax-like objects or wax objects, they tend to melt, they tend to change shape, and all that's based on previous knowledge. You wouldn't be able to know that if you've never seen wax before in your life. You've never seen wax, you never came across it. How would you know what it's going to do before it does it, right? So, one of his arguments is, this goes all the way back to Aristotle. You could argue Aristotle was an empiricist in this regard. Nothing in thought that hasn't first been in the senses, right, is one way to translate the saying of Aristotle. Hume would agree, right? There's no concept, no idea that hasn't been previously in one of my, what he calls it, one of my impressions, right? So all my thoughts or my ideas can be traced back to a preceding impression, like the color red. All of us who are, not colorblind, we can all imagine the color of red if we close our eyes, right? So we have this thought or the idea of the color red. We can imagine a patch of red in our mind. Hume's going to say the reason that we can do that is because we've seen red. If we've never seen red in our lives, say we're blind from birth and we've never seen colors, we wouldn't have that corresponding idea, right? If we're deaf, we wouldn't understand sounds. We might have a language, like if we're blind, we might use color words, but we wouldn't really be able to conceptualize them. People would talk about them, but we would have no experience to draw from. One example I give my students, I forgot where I got this, but imagine you've never tasted an avocado in your life, or let me rephrase that. You're trying to explain to somebody who hasn't tasted an avocado in their entire life what it tastes like. How would you do that? Is there any way you could just describe the flavor of an avocado to them? Hume would say, no, there's no way, right? But the minute they taste it, they know, right? So whether you like the flavor or not, right? Whether you like the flavor of an avocado or not, you have an idea of what the flavor is if you've tasted it. But if not, no way, right? So I feel like I've butchered the point already and spent too much time on this. We haven't even gotten close to getting to Kant, Kant's philosophy of art. But let's recap real quick, and then we'll get to Kant's sort of solution to this, because he's kind of in the middle here, right? So remember, Descartes says, no, my knowledge, how do I know what I know? It comes from my mind, my reasoning, right? I think, I am, and I'm the thinking thing, and all my knowledge is based on thought, etc., etc. Hume says, no. Yes, it's true that you are a mind, and the mind is a thinking thing, but all your thoughts are the result of preceding impressions, right? All your thoughts are memories, they're things that you felt before. Even vague concepts like love, he's going to say, are something that are based on an emotion that you felt, right? You felt love for somebody, and that's where the concept. So even though love might be vague and kind of a nebulous concept, it's every one of us has this sort of kind of idea of what it means, and it might be different, but that's fine with Hume, right? Now, where does Kant come in with this, right? Now, Kant is, when he starts off, is pretty much, I mean, he doesn't follow Descartes. Where's my backspace? I'm not used to using this keyboard here. Yeah, here we go. So Kant, until he's like in his mid-40s, this guy is a die-in-the-wool rationalist. He's not a follower of Descartes per se. He was more influenced by the work of Leibniz and also a follower of Leibniz, a guy named Christian Wolff. But we won't get too much into those details, right? But Kant was a die-in-the-wool rationalist, right? Now, David Hume, I mentioned this in class to my students. Hume was not very well respected as a philosopher during his lifetime, right? Nowadays, he's considered one of the most important philosophers in the West, but he wasn't when he was alive, right? It's largely because of Kant that Hume finally got the accolades that Hume thought he deserved, and Kant as well. Kant reads his book and says, wait a minute, Descartes, Leibniz, all these rationalists, you guys are wrong, right? You've been doing philosophy incorrectly. Now, he doesn't go completely to the empiricist side. Kant he doesn't become an empiricist, right? He takes sort of a middle ground position, right? But he says that, look, if Hume is right, if Hume is correct about some of the things he says, then philosophy can't really conduct itself the way that it has been in the past. Kant thinks that just like the natural sciences have undergone a Copernican revolution, philosophy needs to do the same, right? Because of all these arguments that Hume has leveled against not really just this rationalism, but even against some of his fellow empiricists. We won't get into that too much because it'll get us off topic here. I feel like we're already way off topic, but trust me, this will pay off in the end, right? We're going to get to the art in a minute. But Kant is thinking, look, philosophy in general has been focused on trying to figure out what the objective truth is out there, outside of my experience, okay? So, you've got, people like Descartes are looking at the world, they've got this sort of framework that, I've got kind of diagrammed up here, these silly photos that you see in philosophy textbooks of, some individual, some person looking at the world at some object out there, perceiving a cat, right? And up there's this sort of experience of that cat. This is what Kant would call my representation, right? His jargon is unforgivingly dense and abstruse, so you're going to have to bear with me when we get to the text itself. If you think that this lecture is hard to follow so far, just wait till we dive into the critique. But anyway, so Kant is looking at David Hume. He's looking at David Hume's criticisms of philosophy. He's saying philosophy needs an overhaul, right? We need a Copernican revolution in philosophy, right? Just like Copernicus said, hey, maybe we need to reframe our picture of the universe. We need to recenter things, right? Copernicus with the the first astronomer to hypothesize the heliocentric view of the universe. Maybe the Earth is not in the middle, right? Kant thinks we need to recenter philosophy, right? So how do you do that? What does that mean? Well, people like Descartes, people like Hume were largely, especially the rationalists, I mean more than Hume, they were largely looking at this problem, right? How do I bridge the gap between my representation of the world and the world as it is, right? So here's this object I see out there. I'm looking at this cat, right? I'm having an experience of that cat. How do I know that my experience of that cat matches the actual thing out there, right? How do I even know there's a thing out there, right? Some of these philosophers, like Hume said, for all I know, all it is in my mind, right? For all I know, all there are representations. Descartes famously hypothesized that maybe I'm being deceived by an evil genius and everything I see is all just an illusion in my head, and I couldn't know anything, right? He thinks he gets out of that eventually. But these are the kind of problems that they were working with, right? They were trying to find what they were calling the thing in itself, right? Really technical terminology there for philosophers, right? But what is the thing itself, right? If I see this object out there, what is the actual object? Here's my experience of it. What is the actual thing like? If you're looking at it, you're colorblind, you might see something different. If you're looking at the cat and you're an insect, or if you're like some housefly buzzing around looking at the cat, you're going to see it differently, right? So I want to know what the thing in itself is. Now, Kant says, look, we need to give up the search for the thing in itself, right? We need to forget about the thing in itself, right? That is not going to get us anywhere. We're never going to be able to bridge the gap between our experience of the thing and the thing itself. Hume was right about this. John Locke was right about this. All the empiricists were kind of right about this. The rationalists were wrong. They all thought you could somehow get from your experience to the actual thing through mathematical reasoning and so on and so forth. Now, for some reason, this is freezing up, so hopefully this won't be just a minute. Hit escape, backspace. No. Okay. At least I'm getting an updating bar. Now the next slide I think just crosses out the thing in itself, right? So we don't really have to have that. What is his refocusing? What is his Copernican revolution, and how does this apply to art? We're almost there. We're like 2 slides away. If we just get this thing to push forward. Right, you don't need to, if you're a philosopher, right, you need to stop actually looking for the thing in itself because you're never going to get to it again. That's what the empiricists are going to say. Instead, what you want to find are the conditions that are necessary for the possibility of experience, right? In other words, what conditions make it even possible that I have any representation at all, right? Forget about that thing out there. Right? Forget about that there's an object out there. I'm never going to see it as it is. I'm always going to be stuck with my perceptions of it, right? But are there certain conditions that have to be in place in order for me to perceive the object the way that I do perceive it, right? And obviously I'm having a perception. I can't doubt that. I can't be skeptical about the fact that I'm having an experience. So let's just focus on the experience. And let's focus on what makes that experience possible, what sort of framework has to be in place, what sort of conceptual apparatus, to use a fancy word, has to be in place in order for experience itself to even be possible, right? I'm going to try to fix this real quick, so please bear with me. It's not really working very well. It seems like it's frozen. I guess I'm going to Control-Delete it. See what happens here. I might have to start, I might have to splice these 2 videos together and pause it. Okay. This is really being antsy. process, I guess. Right, okay, so like I said, we need to stop looking for the thing in itself, right? This is his Copernican revolution, right? This is big insight, right? So forget about that object out there, trying to find its, what is it actually like without, my sort of subjective forget that. Let's figure out what makes it even possible for a human being to have an experience in such a way as we do, right? So how does he do this? How does he figure this out, right? What is his methodology, right? The short story, basically he says, this is a very short version of a very complex story, but he says, in order to have an experience, one thing that's necessary, at least as far as humans are concerned, the experience always takes place in space and time, right? This is what he calls the transcendental aesthetic, right? That word aesthetic will be confusing to some of my students who are taking this class because the name of the class is aesthetics, right? And I told them that is philosophy of art, right? Study of philosophy of art and beauty, right? But when he's using the word aesthetic here, he's using it in a very general sense, right? So when he says a transcendental aesthetic, what he means is that this is the way that things appear to us. They always appear in the form of space and time, right? All experience, and this is transcendental, and what that means in this context is that is true of all experience, right? These are always there. These are the elements under which these are some of the necessary conditions. It's necessary that we experience things spatially, temporally, and this seems like a pretty mundane thing to be pointing out, right? Okay, big deal. Wow, we experience things in space and time. What is so insightful about this? Well, what he's saying, right, he's saying that, again, when we talk about experience, oh, geez, what is the fucking deal with this thing? Why is it freezing up? I don't understand. Is it because this thing is overheating? I don't understand. Why is it doing this? Backspace, step, escape. I was getting in a groove there, you see, and then it just won't freaking work. Oh, this is crap. Okay, forget it, man. The previous slide, right? With the little kitty cat, right? So for Kant, right? He's saying that kitty cat out there, right? I perceive that kitty cat out there as taking up space and existing throughout time, right? It has, it's not just there now, but it's there the next moment, the next step, right? So what he's saying though is that I can't assume that those are actually objective qualities of the thing itself, right? These are conditions that I bring with me, right? As the kind of being that I am, I have to see things in space and time. So as far as I know, space and time aren't real. As far as I know, space and time are not a part of the thing in itself. As far as I know, I have to see them that way. They're all just in my mind, right? Space and time is completely in my mind and completely non-objective, right? But in a sense that they're objectively subjective. That's kind of confusing and maybe even sounds contradictory. Maybe it is on the face of it. We're going to get to what that really means, and it's going to apply to art in a big way once we get there, right? So again, to sort of recap the point, space and time are the conditions under which, it's a necessary condition under which we experience anything. And so whether or not it's real that things exist in space and time is irrelevant for Kant, because that's the only way we could know anything. So we might as well just assume them, right? Well, I hate to put it that way. That's a little, I think, over hasty. I don't know if he would go that far, right? But it's impossible to make any sort of certain judgments about anything outside of these conditions, right? That are outside of space and time, okay? Now, what are all these tables up here, right? This table here, the second one at the bottom, this is a table of categories. Obviously, I don't know if you can read it. It's kind of a small print. I don't know if you can read it on your screen there. The table of categories, this is another example of one of what Kant calls a necessary condition for the possibility of experience. Okay, so what is he talking about when he's talking about categories? In your reading, right, in the translation that we have for our class, right, the term is concept, right? But typically, scholars will refer to Kant's categories. Okay, so this is just our own version. So when you see quotes, you see the word concept, you think category. Right? I guess it's maybe irrelevant for this course, but outside in other courses, you might encounter Kant. I'm sure you will. He's kind of a big deal in philosophy, right? But again, back to the matter at hand. The categories, like the transcendental aesthetic, right? Like these elements of space and time, the categories are one of those necessary conditions for experience. Now, what are the categories? These are the way we organize the world, right? These are the way we take all of our sort of inputs, all the perceptions, right? What Kant calls intuitions, kind of more Kant jargon, right? We take all the inputs, right? The feelings, the emotions, what we experience in our, phenomenal existence, to get more Kantian there. All the stuff we experience, we organize it using these concepts, right? Using these categories, right? So how does he make the argument for this? I don't want to get too much into the details of it, right? But the way he comes about this is he lists all the different types of judgments, or what you might call assertions, things that we know or we claim to know, or propositions. This is a list of all the sort of features that judgments have, right? All the kind of features that humans make judgments, and these judgments have these kind of features. For instance, I'm not going to go through all of them. This would take forever, right? We can make a universal judgment, right? Like all cats are feline, right? Or all dogs are mammals, right? Those are universal judgments. They apply to every individual of a certain class. That judgment I just made was also an affirmative judgment, right? That's an example of an affirmative universal judgment. It's categorical, and it's, I guess I'd have to say it's apodictic or assertoric. I'm not really sure. I don't know. Assertive, like I don't want to get into the details on this because it's not really that pertinent for this lecture, right? But the point that is important is that Kant thinks that, look, here's all the type of judgments that we make. In order to make these kind of judgments, like for instance, that all dogs are mammals, that was the one I gave, we have to understand what we're saying. Now, I could be wrong in my judgment. I could say that all dogs are reptiles. That's a false statement, right? All dogs are not reptiles. No dogs are reptiles, right? But that statement, if I did say it, all dogs are reptiles, even though it's false, it's a universal statement. And in order to make it, I would have to have an understanding of unity, right? So all dogs are mammals, all dogs are reptiles, true statements, false statements, whatever, any statement at all, if it's a universal statement, when a person makes that statement and understands it, understands what it means, which I would imagine usually is the case, unless you're just sort of, learning a language and just reciting things you don't know, Kant argues that they have to have a category, right? They have to have an understanding of a category, right? So this makes it kind of sound like a rationalist, right? In order to make a judgment, in order to know anything, I have to have a concept, right? Like unity, right? I have to unify all these different things, right? Look, there's a little fuzzy waggy tail thing that barks. There's a little furry fuzzy waggy tail thing that barks. There's another one. Well, there's a lot of these things. I'm going to unify them, right? I'm going to treat them as one thing. I have to understand what that means to unify them. And I'm going to affirm something. I'm going to assert something about them, right? So all of these, I have to know what's real. I'm affirming what is part of reality. I'm affirming something that has to do with unity. I'm unifying all these different things, right? So again, his basic argument is that we have to be sort of hardwired. We have to have these concepts. We take in our experience, and from that, we take in our experience. Our experience is the result of taking in all these perceptions and organizing them with the categories, right? That's a better way of saying it, really, right? We take in all these perceptions and we organize them using these categories, which he thinks are just there. It's part of being human. To be human is to be rational, which means is to have an understanding of things like inherence and subsistence, that, you know, that's how you know that the wax is still the wax, because it adheres, right? Even though it changes, there's something underlying it that adheres, right? There's this understanding of that, right? So for Kant, both the empiricists and the rationalists go too far, right? We're almost done with this. I'm almost there, right? In fact, let me stop the video right here.